Very good.
Okay, I will get started, and I will appreciate if you mute yourselves throughout the seminar, and then we will always have the Q&A in the end, and we will both use the voice and the text. So this is Güneş Murat Tezcur. I am the Celal Çağlayan Chair and Professor at University of Central Florida, and we are very glad to host Kemal Süleymani today. I mean, up until this year, we were all having lots of events, but everything was on campus. So this basically became like a curse and blessing at the same time. It is a curse because we are basically not able to bring people to campus, but this is a blessing because we can obviously bring illustrious scholars like Kemal virtually, and then basically they can share their insights with our audience. We organized an event in the beginning of October, so this is our second event this semester, and we are going to continue with some other events in November, so please tune in. So I will just basically briefly introduce Kemal. And I have never met him earlier, but I'm very familiar with his work. I will say that he's doing some very interesting work on Iranian Kurdistan, on Roshilat. That has been mostly the silent part. If you think about that famous book, Everything is Silent on the Western Front, people used to say that everything has been silent on the Eastern Front, which basically means that Iranian Kurds have been more like the silent people. But at the same time, you are talking about, I will say, after the Kurdish part of Turkey, the Kurdish part of Iran basically are the most populous in 4 pieces of Kurdistan. So there's actually a kind of a long history of Kurdish activism also in the country. So let me basically tell brief things about his background. So Dr. Süleymani received his PhD in 2014 from Columbia University. And I mean, I was basically trying to keep track of his basic movements. So I think his life story kind of resembles basically a kind of typical Kurdish activist and academician because he worked in many different universities, and he's currently as an assistant professor in El Colegio de Mexico. So he's currently based in Mexico City. So he wrote a book in 2016, which was published by Palgrave. It is called Islam and Competing Nationalisms in the Middle East. So there's actually one thing I just want to say, and that will be also a surprise to Kemal, because Kemal wrote an article with Ahmet Mohammedpour last year, which was published in British Journal of Sociology. So that article actually questions the term tribalism, which has been often used in the studies of Kurdish people. And they actually develop a very incisive criticism of this term. And then I'm basically very pleased to say that our committee, which was composed of Metin Yüksel, who's basically with us, and Özlem Göner, who is at City University of New York, basically decided that that is actually an article which should be the co-winner of the best article in Kurdish political studies this year. So congratulations, Kemal. I mean, I didn't want to email you this morning. I just want to basically wait until this moment to basically inform you about that. But we will be in touch basically with the paperwork and other things. And for those of you who are not very familiar with that, that is basically a competition we organize every year. It basically looks at the articles published in the previous year by a rising scholar, which basically means that anybody who is not a tenured scholar can be eligible as long as they publish an English article in a peer-reviewed journal. And then we basically just try to promote basically good scholarship in Kurdish studies. So, and we will make a formal announcement, but again, I just want to let Kemal informally at the moment. Okay, so I mean, that is all from me for now. Again, Kemal is going to speak probably to up to 40 minutes, and then we are going to open up the room for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can actually write them to the chat box, and then we will be happy to pass them to Kemal, or you can actually wait until the end of his talk to basically ask your questions. I believe he's going to start his presentation with a short clip video. Sarah, if you don't mind, please put that on. Thank you. And Sarah, please unmute yourself because we cannot hear the voice.
A smuggler's route. Every day, hundreds of pickup trucks carry goods to this camp. It's one of many dotted along the border. Where I'm standing is the Iraqi Kurdistan border, a triangle between Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. Every day, hundreds of Iranian Kurds, young and old, cross the border to pick up a load of goods to carry back to Iran. But it's a long, dangerous, and difficult journey. These smugglers are from poor Kurdish towns and villages in Iran. I meet Khizr, a 70-year-old father of 5.
زن و بچه‌نو نو یک نو لقمه پیدا کنید. الان اومدین اونجا این دیستگر میزنم 100 تومان میدم به من.
100,000 تومان.
100 تومان میدم به من میبرم اونجا. از اونجا کریم ماتور کریم ماشین اینا میدم برای من هفته 6,000 تومان میمونه.
2 months ago, Khez had a stroke. Now he has a tooth infection.
لازم عمل کنم. من الان میرم عملش میکنم میگه 150 میلیون تومان بده. پول ندارم برای خودم درست کنم.
They're challenging me if I can carry this load, so let's give it a try. He's 70 years old. I am almost half of his age. So let's see if I can carry it for a... Okay. Believe it or not, it's impossible even to take a step. The region was always neglected, but Western sanctions against Iran have made it worse.
هیچ کاری نیست. مثلا تو کردستان کارخونه نیست. کارخونه نیست مثلا چیکار کنی؟
Ali is also 70. He has 10 children and says most of them are university graduates who can't find any work.
والله تقریبا 50 تومن 40 تومانی تو
40,000 تومان. چی میتونی با 40,000 تومان بخری در ایران؟
والله ایجاب باشه دیگه که یکم خرج در میاری کفش میخری که یه دفعه که برنج میخری یه دفعه که خان میخری.
The smugglers sometimes manage to bribe the Iranian border guard. But most of the time, they have to take illegal routes through minefields.
چند دفعه مردم کشته شدن از رگای قاچاقی میرن میکشن یه پا میشن سرما میبره.
Kurdish human rights groups say more than 100 smugglers have been shot dead by Iranian border guard just in the past year. Khazar's load weighs more than 120 kilos. He has a difficult road ahead. The Islamic Republic of Iran says these people are hurting the economy. But for Khez and thousands like him, it is the only way to feed their families. Gio Gol, BBC News, on the Iraq-Iran border.
No insurance? Aspen Dental has you covered with a...
Okay, can I start?
Yeah, please go on, Kemal.
Okay, let me first thank Dr. Khazri, Dr. Tazjour, and Ms. Sarah Balagoni, as well as the Kurdish program at Central Florida University for organizing this event. I am truly honored, and also thanks to everyone who is present here. So let me first acknowledge that almost everything I say is based on the joint research that I have done with Dr. Ahmed Mohammadpour, my friend who is at USM Harris now. Hopefully he will have another event to present or explain other aspects of Kolberi, but almost everything I say here, at least the written remarks, are shared views. So I want to clarify this first. And the second thing, let me, for people who are not familiar with the subject, we have two terms that you should keep it in mind and remember. One is Kolberi, which is the work or labor, and the other one is Kolber, which is the worker. So As you saw in this clip, even Giargul, he himself is a Kurd, refers to them as smugglers or smuggling, which is not, Kolberi is not smuggling, and I am going to explain this. I talk a little bit about the Kolberi, and then I will try to base our explanations. I use ours because most of the things I say is shared by Dr. Ahmed Mohammed Pur and I. The Kolber narratives, and try to portray Kolberi as a labor from their perspective. And if there be any time, I talk about the context of Kolberi, but Dr. Tasjour or whoever organizes the thing, they can stop me whenever they want. So I might go on until you stop me. I don't have any idea about the time. So in Kurdish, Kolberi refers to the young and old cross-border labor in which people called Kolbers carry goods on their backs across the borders of Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. It is a dangerous form of labor, as Kolbers are regularly shot by Iranian armed forces or die from falling off mountains, walking into minefields, and even the underage Kolbers have been subjected to various sexual assaults and rapes. Kolberi as a phenomenon evidences an entrenched development in Kurdistan, which is the byproduct of exceptional security conditions created by the state itself. Kolberi showcases the fundamental ethno-cultural dynamics and resultant economic and political disparity in Iran, where the ruling Persian ethno-nation has monopolized all forms of power and means of production. The severe economic conditions of Kurdistan evidences ethno-linguistic and religious cleavages. Therefore, Kolberi is an outcome of an internal colonialism similar to what Sarah Roy terms as the development. The development is a process through which a hegemonic power adopts hindering strategies to deliberately block internal economic development and structural reform. I should also note that Dr. Veli Yadigri has written a great book on the issue of the development in northern Kurdistan or Kurdistan in Turkey. Kolberi is a relatively recent phenomenon. While the classic form of smuggling has had a long history in what is called borderland region, Kolberi in its current practice became prominent mostly after 2009. In recent years, especially the medium age of Kolbers have become increasingly younger, and it ranges from 13 to 65. Sorry. From 2015 to 2019, the average age of both injured and killed Kolbers is 29. This is the average age. Now, Kolbers' background are diverse. Kolbers can be accomplished athletes or promising MA or PhD students. For instance, Keyvan Far from the Kurdish city of Power received an MA degree in urban planning, and Baqir Ahmadi from Mariwan had secured the rank of 12 in the nationwide university admission exam and received an MA in urban planning. And this rank 12 is, for people who are familiar with the national exam, what they call it, or concours in Iran, is extraordinary in many ways. Taha Ghaffari, who has been forced to Kolberi, is a renowned athlete and a winner of multiple national and international awards. A typical Kolber carries a load between at least 5 to 8 kilos or around 160 pounds. They are paid between 33 to 75 cents per kilo, depending on their age and physical ability. A Kolber might make 5 to 10 trips a month and earn $67, which is far below the poverty line of $600 declared by the state in 2016. Kolberi is not technically illegal, but it is punishable by death without even ever being designated as a crime. There are no laws criminalizing Kolberi, and yet they are regularly shot or thrown off cliffs by the state forces, or die in the minefields, and so forth. There is not a legal mechanism, however, that allows redressing the grievances of those Kolbers who fall victim to the state violence. Since 2015, direct shooting has taken a great toll of Kolber's life. In that year alone, 126 Kolbers were killed as a result of direct shooting. According to the Kurdish Human Rights Network, 42 Kolbers were also shot dead in 2016, which is about 70% of them. 70% of them were married, and 3 of them were under the age of 18. Similarly, in 2017, the state's forces direct shooting left 73 Kolbers dead and 154 Kolbers injured. The state forces killed 25 Kolbers in the first 6 months of 2018 alone. Some of them, like Ali Nasiri and Farhad Zandi, were shot in the head. Nasiri was married and had 2 children. Atrocities are not limited to killing and injuring Kolbers. Unlawful arrests, torture, and hiding Kolbers' dead bodies, and sexual adults and rape all have become common practices of the state forces, of course, in the cause of Allah. Often weeks or months after their death, locals find Kolber's corpse marked by undeniable signs of torture. For instance, on February 11, 2018, the body of Shwana Rasuli from Bana was found. His legs and hands were tied. All signs indicated that he had been tortured before he was shot dead. After 70 days of imprisonment and torture, the dead body of Abu Bakr Maulania from Maku was returned to his family. He had been previously reported missing. Getting shot is the most frequently reported incident. From 2015 to 2020, 725 Kolbers were wounded or injured as a result of direct shooting. Moreover, escaping from or being beaten by border patrols often leads to severe injuries or death. The majority of the injured Kolbers refuse to seek medical treatments for their fear of state persecution, which in return might lead to their death. Since 2009, the number of missing Kolbers has drastically increased, as during winter trips, Kolbers become easily disoriented and end up frozen to death. For instance, the 2 brothers Farhad and Azad Khosravi, 14 and 17 years old, respectively, after they went missing for 3 days, were found dead and frozen on December 12, 2019. The tragic deaths of these underage or the tragic deaths of these 2 brothers shows the greater fragility of the underage Kolbers. Just like adults, the underage are the target of the state forces' direct shooting. It must be mentioned that the state's development policies in Kurdistan have even compelled women to engage in Kolberi, which we don't have the exact number of them for a variety of reasons. I will, if there will be questions, I will talk about it in the QA and section. In the 1980s, the state planned millions of mines, particularly in the 4 provinces of Western Azerbaijan, Sanandaj, Ilam, and Kermanshah. 3 decades later, the uncleared landmines continue to take a great toll on the lives of villagers, mostly women and children. With the rise of Kolberi, many Kolbers die or suffer serious injuries because of the explosion of mines. Nevertheless, despite the severe difficulties, the state courts often find the affected Kolbers large sums of money. For instance, in 2017, Luqman Vahidi, who had lost 1 leg and 1 eye in a mine explosion, was fined to pay 11 million tumans for illegal border crossing. Many Kolbers end up dying because of their attempts to avoid state forces ambushes. Many die of hypothermia if they don't fall from mountain cliffs during the nightly journeys. Kolberi represents life and labor on the edge, not just in its legal or political or economic or geographical sense. It also often leads to a physical impasse for people who embrace those life-endangering journeys to overcome the peril of poverty. One frequently hears stories similar to the following accounts by an educated Kolber that I never forgot the day when a friend of mine who was also married fell on the ground with his load on his back. I approached him to help. He was crying, shivering from the cold and exhaustion. His blood sugar level had severely dropped. The weather was frigid and beating, and his load was heavy. With a shaking voice, he said that he no longer wanted to live. He handed over his knife to me. Please end my life with this knife. I took his load down and had it somewhere to deliver it to the owner by the next day. Had not I stopped him, he would have killed himself right where we were. Our analysis, means Dr. Mohammadpour and I's analysis of the existing data and Kolber's narrative suggests that Kolberi must be perceived as a multifaceted configuration of a life situated on the edge. Living on the edge, which signifies Kurdish communal life, is a concept that characterizes the spatial and temporal dimension of Kolber's life and labor reflected in their own narratives. Living on the edge illustrates the fragility and precarity of Kolber's life. The phrase on the edge depicts Kolber's life world as a microcosm of the world of marginality and perilousness of the non-sovereign Kurds. In a paper that Dr. Muhammad and I wrote, we elaborated upon how Kolber's personal stories portray Kurdish economic and political predicaments as they are characterized as borderland people or those who live on the edge. For instance, from the perspective of our participants, the national suppression category has given birth to Kolberi. Kolbers frequently raise issues of their ethnic, religion, and language identities as determinative factor in the impoverishment of their region. The following story by a Kolber from the Kurdish city of Mariwan illustrates such institutionalized injustice. I've published several academic papers on city planning and management and submitted them to our city mayor and council. I decided to apply for a PhD program and got the rank 12 in the admission exam for urban planning. However, the officials disqualified me despite my academic success. This was the beginning for the darkest days in my life. I started looking for jobs, but all doors were closed to me. I was also a member of the wrestling team, but I had to abandon wrestling for Kolberi. I am not the only person whose entry to the universities has been barred. Many Sunni Kurdish youths share my fate. In our interviews with Kolbers, they continuously pointed to structural asymmetries, and they tend to believe that the object poverty and the development which has given rise to Kolberi is an outcome of a well-thought state strategy. Quote, if the state wanted, it would have eradicated Kolberi completely, a Kolber from Ushnavia says. Therefore, Kolbers rarely differentiate Ajam, non-Persian, non-Shi'i Persian, non-Kurdish Shi'i Persians, sorry. So from the state itself, Kurdish reference to Persians and those who represent the state as Ajam exhibits their communal self-differentiation and a socio-political distance to the center. Ajam is viewed to be organically associated with job discrimination, lack of investment, and ethno-religious discrimination. The scope and depth of distance between the center and periphery, which would be Kurdistan, and their asymmetric power relation also find expression in using or alluding to the national repression phrase. Kurdish Kolbers use this phrase to show their distance to those who work for or with the state, even if they are fellow Kurds. Kurdish members of parliaments, for instance, are viewed as those who, especially during their election campaigns, try, quote, to normalize Kurdish oppression with their empty promises and catchy slogans, Kolber, quote unquote, Kolber from Bana. Participants express their anger with the Kurdish MPs' attempts to frame Kolberi as just another symptom of the economic mismanagement rather than as a result of asymmetric power relation between Kurds and the center. A Kolber from Sardash said, quote, as far as I know, some of these MPs, instead of eradicating this perilous thing from our region, they are trying to institutionalize it. They want to make it even more prevalent by giving Kolberi ID cards and insurance, end quote. For many Kurds who are living on the so-called borderland, Kolberi has become a path to survival. While our participants refer to Kolberi as a low-income, transient, unreliable, and dangerous work, they desperately stick to it as their only mean for economic survival. I should, based on the figures that we have, I should indicate that we have about 170,000 to 200,000 Kolbers, which means about 1/10 of Kurdish family. 1/10 of Kurdish families, yes, are living on Kolberi. So, desperation, low earning, and being the only breadwinner are among the most frequently mentioned words in Kolber's narratives. Kolbers view their circumstance to be a direct outcome of the existing political realities in Kurdistan. Therefore, they cannot decouple Kolberi from their Kurdish identity. To them, despite its precarious nature, Kolberi evidences their moral fiber and standing by the principles at trying times, or in their own words, a handicapped Kolber says, I am prepared to be arrested, even to be killed. I would rather die than begging for money. So I return to my city and I can help some low-income families as well. For each load that I carry, I will donate about $2 to indigent families that I know, end quote. As stated earlier, Kolberi is not a normal form of labor in normal circumstances. It is a fendicious ordeal and fraught with fatal dangers. As a Kolber from Mahabad describes it, quote, whenever we leave for Kolberi, there is no guarantee that we make it home again, safe and sound, end quote. And yet it's only available to a few times a month. Kolbers do not own their loads. This will cause a great deal of anxiety and concern. To receive their payments, they have to bring their loads to the designated places on time. However, Kolbers often have to run for their lives as they constantly face the state armed forces. In such circumstances, to save their lives, they would have to abandon their loads. As a Kolber from Sardash relates, quote, at times we will have to compensate the owners for the loss. And often owners could be in cahoot with the Revolutionary Guard scope. So The family issues too have to be added to the above problems. The family issues illustrate the interaction between Kolbers and their families and the ways in which their work may endanger them. As a Kolber from the city of Banes testifies, Kolber's family lives are also fraught with anxiety. Quote, even if you don't have a wife and children, you sense your mom's gaze on the door as she anxiously awaiting your safe return, end quote. The families of Kolbers grapple with an all-pervasive fear of losing their breadwinner. If their breadwinner is killed, injured, or disabled, there is no one for the family, no social support, no medical insurance. Their families will end up in an absolute state of loss and despair. Many Kolbers die or become seriously injured after falling off mountain cliffs or rocks while escaping from the state forces' attacks. Hypothermia is also reported as another main cause of Kolber's death. At times, Kolbers fall into the second ambush or walk into a landmine or get caught in snow when they try to change their routes to avoid the first ambush. Moreover, Kolber's constant exposure to harm might lead to fatal inflections that could throw their marital relationships into an utter state of despair. A Kolber from Bane relates a story of how, quote, someone he knew became impotent, unable to sleep with his wife again after carrying 150 kilograms on his back, end quote. In some cases, physical harm of Kolberi results in dysfunctional family relations or divorce. In describing their lived experiences, our interviewers depict the state as it is there to kill. They point to episodes of arrest, law seizure, and interrogations by the state official Khizr, which you saw in the clip. A 47-year-old Kolber tells the story of his interrogation resulting from his interview with a BBC reporter. He recounts that the interrogators, quote, said, "You have dishonored our country." I replied that I did nothing wrong. The BBC guy was going to help me, and I just thanked him. I just talked about my life and my job. The security officer took my ID and never gave it back to me, end quote. The category of dispossession of life demonstrates the centrality of the state violence in Kolber's lived experience. The concept that we have constructed from the data are strongly supported and confirmed by our quantitative resource. So let's talk a little bit, if I have time, a little bit about the context of Kolberi. Kolberi is a direct outcome of a hierarchical ethno-nationalist and religious system that has segregated Kurds and their economic life through its division of the polity into sovereign versus non-sovereign ethno-nations. Kolberi is an economic situation, but it is first and foremost a symptom of a broader political, juridical, cultural context of Iran, which has given birth to this apartheid system. The state strategy is inherently discriminatory and racist, keeps Kurdistan economically segregated and systemically distorts its development. Not long after Ayatollah Khomeini's return to Iran in 1979, Kurds faced full-fledged military campaigns. Their cities were seized and their civilians were massacred. What the Islamic Republic calls Fath, or the conquest of Kurdistan, which began right after the 1979 revolution. Sorry, I think I misread this. Anyways, it ushered a new era of political enclosure and economic breakdown, and soon was exacerbated with 8 years of Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. The war helped the regime to consolidate its power and became a pretext for greater militarization of Kurdistan and turning it into a combat zone. The militarization facilitated the RI's internal colonial project through military projects and expansion, land seizure, water transfer, cultural domination, and an intense form of a uni-ethno-religious economic development. Throughout the Iran-Iraq war, Kurdish cities were under constant airstrikes and bombardments, consequently raising livestock. A main pillar of Kurdistan's rural economy was mostly decimated. Significant spaces of Kurdish economic activities such as farms, gardens, and pastoral lands were turned into minefields. During the war, the regime planted millions of landmines, more than 16 million of which remain uncleared, disrupting traditional practice of farming and raising livestock. While the state devastated the economic life of rural Kurdistan, it made no investment in any infrastructure or alternative employment opportunities in any other areas. Even for employment in the public sector, the state pursued a policy of disindigenation. The public sector employment was also used to co-opt Kurds in the state's expansionist projects in Kurdistan. Unlike the sovereign Persian community, Kurds have been systematically marginalized. In some subtle ways, the RI's Islamic Republic's practice resembled that of South African apartheid regime. The Persian ethno-nation, through its use of double game of sovereignty, articulates the discourse of belonging, sets the rules for the moral community, and uses this very discourse of inclusion to marginalize what the state calls deviant or ashrar Kurds economically, culturally, and legally. Marginalizing the non-sovereign Kurdish community and regulating their dispossession resembles the constituting policies of the apartheid regime in South Africa. In South Africa, the core of the apartheid policies was founded on discriminatory laws regarding ownership, access to resources, and occupying property. In Kurdistan, the systemic development policies of the Islamic State approximates the strategies of the South African apartheid regime for dispossessing the Black community. The Islamic Republic has been destroying farming, thwarting raising animals, and depopulating rural areas through building enormous dams, transferring natural resources like waters, rivers, to non-Kurdish Shi'i regions. Such strategies evidences the Islamic Republic's plan for radical transformation in Kurdistan and complicating Kurdish livelihood on the other side of the border, I mean the Iraqi Kurdistan, because some of the waters and rivers go there. And I should add now, the state has come up with another project that's called the Red Line, border red line, which they are currently trying to actually remove some of the population from a number of villages, which they call it the red border line. So they are learning from each other, from Saddam, from Erdogan, and the rest. These states. While the Islamic State has kept other Iranian borders relatively open to international trade, through securitization of Kurdistan, it has suppressed Kurdish economic activities and violently dealt with those who use their own body for the cross-border labor. The state used the Iran-Iraq war to expand military infrastructure and occupy all Kurdish towns and villages with its military facilities. As Eling points out, Kurdish cities and villages, quote, were heavily militarized while the civilian population suffered under the indiscriminate bombings, claiming huge casualties and causing rapid depopulation, end quote. While significant portions of the city space and their surroundings were allocated to military expansion due to the lack of medical facilities, the people for any proper medical treatments had to go to the provincial capitals in Kurdish provinces. Meanwhile, the state's militarization process radically subsided raising livestock and reduced farming. The regime inflicted greater misery on the people by expanding minefields and banning the farmers' movement in pursuit of pastoral lands. The latter was supposed to disrupt the organic ties between people and in the rural areas and Kurdish fighters. This way, the regime expedited the destruction of the Kurdish enclave's economy through its economic and spatial investment in the militaristic infrastructure and ecological terror. In Iran, Kurdish exclusion is constitutionally sanctioned. The Islamic Republic's constitution disqualifies non-Shiites to occupy key state positions such as presidency. See the Article 116 in the constitution. They cannot run for presidency, nor they can become a member of the cabinet, National Security Council, the Expediency Council, the Guardian Council, or the Council of Experts. In the last 40 decades, not a single Sunni Kurd has been allowed to serve in any key state decision-making position. The state bureaucracy, laws, and organization are all structured around the exclusion of non-Shi'i, non-Persian communities like Kurds. Kurds have also been barred from entry in the key intelligent and military positions. The Islamic Republic is a segregationist state whose policies and laws are founded on certain constitutional stipulations, shielding categorical ethno-religious organization of the polity. Discrimination against the Kurds holding lower offices is not stipulated in the constitution. Nevertheless, all discriminatory appointments and institutional exclusions correspond to the spirit of the Constitution as it necessitates ordering the state and society in accordance with the two pillars of the official identity, Shi'ism, Shi'i Islam, and Persianism. I think Aryanism should be added as well. In the words of Rasmus Illing, the Constitution, quote, creates a legal political order that fundamentally discriminates against all non-Shi'is, end quote. The sovereign ethno-nation strives to tribalize Kurdistan and abstract its contact with the capital modernity, and concurrently it has framed Kurdish demand as a sign of the regional backwardness, the same thing that you see in Turkey. In the last 4 decades, the regime, under the pretext of exceptional security situation, has obstructed industrial economic development in Kurdistan. This reality is evidenced by the fact that there is only one sugar factory built in 1968 in the entire Kurdish inhabited region of West Azerbaijan. The state has used the discourse of the security situation in Kurdistan, to expand and reinforce non-Kurdish control and to fracture Kurdishness, both geographically and politically, and B, to transfer the region's natural resources to non-Kurdish ones and perpetuate the development policies in Kurdistan. In this sense, the state policies in Kurdistan are also comparable with that of South African apartheid regime, where the PACT regime of 1934 laid the foundation for the apartheid system in initiating its job control and reservation policies. these policies were foundational for the discriminatory distribution of resources, dispossessing black farmers and reducing their wages and products. In South Africa, such policies turned blacks into unskilled, semi-skilled, cheap labor forces who were eventually compelled to flock to the white industrial zones. Similarly, in Kurdistan, the Islamic Republic's development and colonial dispossession policies have produced three types of cheap labor: cheap and unskilled labor force, migrants, seasonal laborers, and Kolberi. So thank you very much. I stop here to have some room for question and answers.
So Kemal, thank you very much for this very engaging on this very important, but also, I would say, sad topic. I also have questions, but I will maybe first give the floor to our audience, and then, as I told in the beginning, you can actually write a question, and then I will be happy to share it with Kemal, or you can raise your hand. I think I can see you, and then I can basically give you the option to ask a question. So either way should be fine. And I just sent a link, by the way. If you look at the chat, this is basically the article Ahmet Mohabbatpour and Kemal Sulami published exactly on this topic earlier this year in British Journal of Sociology. So for those of you who are more interested in the topic, you can obviously find the article highly relevant. Yeah. So maybe I should ask a question, because maybe just like open the floor. I mean, probably I have like maybe 10 questions, but I just need to see you in person to have a more like a meaningful conversation. But I mean, your talk reminds me, obviously, Judith Butler's notion of precarity. So if you look at how she talks about this precarity, she basically says that certain lives are much less lamentable than others, which basically means that you basically just become sad for the loss of a life of certain people more than others. And then she basically kind of thinks about like how this implies to American foreign policy, especially 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then many other instances, not only in the globally, but also like you can think about like in the United States. So my question is that you talk about all these hundreds of Kolbers who were murdered by the regime. So when somebody was killed, does the regime really allow his family and his relatives or the broader village to have a like open funeral where they can actually basically, I'm not sure it is the right word, but let's say for the sake of the argument, like celebrate the life of the person and basically have some kind of ceremonies, or even the funerals were highly restricted by the government. So I will appreciate some of your observations on that.
Thank you. The Kurds have learned to repeat and kind of plagiarize Black Lives Matter. So Kurdish Lives Matter is, again, it's, yes, there are some deaths that are lamentable and they are important. You feel their absence, but there are some, it's like Kolbers or killing Kolbers is an ordinary thing. So as I've in many instances talked about it, Kurds are really perceived as killable. This is not limited to Iran, this situation. You have the same situation in Turkey as well. For example, there are Kurds killed for singing, or people here, they sing in Kurdish, or you have 90,000 mosques filled with people who they can easily say, people on the other side of the border, because our state doesn't like them, they are infidels, and we have to be, we should show no mercy to them. Ashidda'u ala al-kuffar. And this is, unfortunately, when it comes to the Kurdish situation, this is a kind of something shared that in the entire Middle East. But what you have in Iran, yes, when they die, there is a restricted, they restrictly allow, or they allowed with some restriction for the people to be buried. But of course, the news and all the things that are written about these Kolbers are mostly by human rights group that are active outside Iran, and they have not only human rights group, even environmentalist groups, Kurdish environmentalist groups are extremely, they through extreme, they deal with extreme measures and extreme forms of persecution on the part of the state. So yes, they are allowed to be buried, but certainly with a greater deal of restriction. But what is sad about this is the fact that the Kolbers' life and their death is mostly matter to the Kurds themselves. And while, yes, there are certain, we have a lot of repression in entire Iran, but when a Persian, an individual when is executed, there will be a lot of fuss about it, which is good, which is right, and there has to be, these things have to be dealt with this way. There has to be a lot of outrage on the part of people, but in reality, almost every day, we have almost everyday killing of a Kolber, and there are days that you have maybe 20 Kolbers killed and one wounded. So killing the Kolbers is a norm. It's a daily thing, and it is pretty much accepted. And there are certain people, despite the fact it's become the story, even imagine someone like Khamenei says, the supreme leader says, Kolbers are innocent, don't kill them. Of course, he's the same guy who gives all these authorities to the border patrols to kill them. But while someone like Khamenei says, don't kill them, there are still people from the center which they say, these people carry this and carry this, or they might carry, for example, alcohol, and therefore their death is justified. So this is the situation. Unfortunately, the fact the Perso-Shi'i constituency, majority of this group, either silently or implicitly or explicitly supports these killings, it really helps the state to continue that with impunity or with a greater in a much bolder way. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have 4 questions. I will ask you 2 by 2, but let me just say something as a comment. I think both Iranian and Turkish public opinion is understudied topics when it comes to the Kurdish question, because people typically think about the issue as states. The Iranian and the Turkish states basically are repressive towards the Kurds. But obviously, I mean, the states, despite the fact that they have very authoritarian characteristics, are obviously represent like broader publics. And I see, I mean, my friend and colleague Ekram Karakoç, he studies Turkish public opinion. And then when you look at basically the numbers, you basically see that, yes, I mean, you are completely right. When it comes to Kurds, there's basically much less sympathy in the broader public opinion. So that, I think this is a very important topic by itself. Okay, so I will say that since I have 2 questions which look similar to each other, I will say with both Neşe Özgen and Benjamin Price questions. So Neşe Özgen basically asks you, she mentioned about her own research. In my research, as the border regime changed, so the mechanisms amount of bribery. So she wonders if this deaths could be caused by the increase. Is the regime of the border economy changing, or is the economy changing entirely? So she's basically asking this, I think, the relation between the briberies and then the execution of the Kolbers. And then let me also ask Benjamin's question, because I think they're both about like the similar topic. And then maybe Neşe ask a second question. Is there anybody other than the Kurds working as Kolbers? So it's all about the Kurdish people, or are there some non-Kurdish Kolbers? And then Benjamin has a question, and he also refers to his own fieldwork. So he says that I am familiar with the Kolberi process on the Iraqi-Turkish border. So in most cases, the products they are transporting are either tax dodges or workarounds to get into Syria through Turkey. So in Iran, could the illegality of the Kolberi be considered punishment of tax dodging? So is it more about like kind of dodging tax practices? And then do you know who owns the Iran Kolberi products being transported? It is actually one of my questions, but I didn't want to ask it. So who are the people who own the goods? And then finally, do we know if there's any system of rewards set up for Pastaran, the border guards, obviously, that catch or execute Kurdish Kolbers? I mean, I think there are like 4 or 5 different questions here, but I think they all speak to the same topic. So please.
Okay, so hopefully I'll be able to remember them all because I have not taken notes. If I forget,
I can remind you.
Okay, so let me say one thing. In the beginning, I talked about the fact that Kolberi is neither legal nor illegal or criminal. And this is because of the fact that state gives ID cards to Kolbers. Many of these Kolbers have ID cards. And as in my remarks, I mentioned that some of these MPs, they are trying, as Kolbers themselves were talking about the fact that the MPs are trying to institutionalize Kolberi. So Kolberi is not a criminal thing. It's not illegal, but it's not legal either. So it represents or stays in this liminal space of legality and illegality, which is almost like everything Kurdish. So, but people who have ID cards, they are stopped by border patrols. They show their ID cards, and stopped, they show the ID cards, and they are still being shot at. So this is the situation. It's not like paying tax or something. So what you have in Turkey is, in many ways, is different. That's why I said it's not smuggling, because people are recognized by the state because they were given ID card to be involved in this. But it's up to the state patrols or forces, to border patrols or state forces, to recognize or refuse the ID cards. So it's completely whimsical, and it's not a personal thing. It's actually the politics of Kolberi. So why we have this situation? Let me first talk about this part. In 2009, when Ahmadinejad came back to power, in many ways it was a bolder and greater comeback of the Revolutionary Guards. And since then, especially it was a post-reformist era, Revolutionary Guards control almost everything in Iran. And Ahmadinejad, along with these Revolutionary Guards, they had a policy to keep Kurds in this liminal space of hunger and prosperity, which would be part of these the development policies, that Kurdistan should never be prosper enough, that Kurds would think about politics, about create, and would it help for Kurdistan to remain viable and become, or could think about a Kurdish political entity. And this was mostly a reaction to what we had in the other side of the borders in Iraqi Kurdistan. There was a constitutionally recognized Kurdish entity. So there was federalism. There were talks about Kurdish independence, Kurdish referendums and things, which especially the issue of independence and talks about it started in 2005. So there is a letter that is attributed to Ahmadinejad that says we should keep Kurds in this state of almost death and life, this in between. And therefore, so Kolberi is a product of a certain politics where Kurdish economy in Kurdistan is one of the tools that, or the mechanisms of control the state uses economy as part of it is, so it's one aspect of this is politics, and it's used as a disciplinary measure. So that's in Turkey, you have certain rules, which my friend Frat Boschali studied this subject extensively about the goods that you bring in, the goods you export, and so there are certain rules. If there be a punishment, how it should be. So there are detailed laws about any illegal exportation or importation of the goods. In Iran, we don't have this situation. The Kurds are given these ID cards, and it was mostly, there were variety of fleeting markets in different Kurdish city, which was an extension of the same policy of depopulating Kurdish rural areas, because Kurdish rural areas are seen as a place where, first of all, as long as the people are there, it would be hard to export or exploit the entire natural resources. And then the water resources and everything could not be easily transferred to other areas. So it is a part of a broader state politics to depopulate Kurdish region. It's along with deforestation, along with these dam projects and so forth. And at the same time, so while they were opening these markets, after a while, the markets would be closed because, so they would bring people to the cities, they remove them from their own habitats, and then they would create these dependencies on these borders. And now what do you have? It's not, the amount they earn is not taxable to begin with. And the issue is not tax, and the state has never talked about tax. They actually, this revolutionary guards have created a mafia that people who bring these goods, they are not owning them. So people, when you carry a load as a kolber, you don't own anything. You are paid for carrying. So this is a very important difference that we had with the smuggling. Classical smuggling was mostly done by animals like horse, donkeys, mules, and other things. These people they use their own bag. And then people who did smuggling in the previous era, they would own the goods that they were exporting or importing. Now we don't have this situation, and there is no exportation in that. So people do not carry any goods from the Iranian side to the Iraqi side, unlike the classic smuggling. So this is what we have in Iran is a part of, Kolberi is a part of Kurdish depopulation and dispossession policies. It's not anything else. So, and it should be seen in this context. I forget the other questions.
Kemal, question was, are there any Kolbers who are not Kurds?
So only in Balochistan, which they are Balochs and Sunnis, like Kurds. They are both. So in Kurdistan, we have majority of Kurdish population are Sunnis. We have Shias and other different religious minorities. Balochistan has a similar situation, ethnically different and religiously different. There is something similar to Kolberi in Balochistan, which is located in the eastern part on the Iranian and Pakistani border. So, but I really have not studied that. And by the amount I read about it, the Kurdish situation is a lot worse in terms of the issue of Kolberi, despite the fact Balochistan is naturally much poorer than Kurdistan. It's a desert, and there is a possibility there. There is a possibility of narcotic and other things in Kurdistan. We don't have this situation, but so there is the only area that we have a similar case in the entire Iran. The other borders in Iran are mostly open to what is called international trade, unlike the Kurdish region. And the other question was, sorry.
That's okay, because I mean, but I think your response was kind of like mostly emphasizing the obviously political dimensions of the phenomenon rather than basically whether it's related to tax dodging or bribery. So I mean, I think that was more likely your response. So let me switch to a question from UCF students. So Mohammed Alawad is asking, what factor contribute greatly to the marginalization of Kurds under the Islamic Republic? So is it more about their distinct ethnic identity or ethno-nationalist identity, or their distinct religious identity?
I think, so as I said, the Iranian nationalism has two pillars, actually has three pillars to be more precise. One is Aryanism, which is a racial thing, and if you study, in our articles and papers, we talked about this. If you study Persian books now, the Islamic textbooks, there is a great amount of talk about Aryanism, so Aryan race. From the state perspective, the Kurds are Aryan, whatever Aryan means. So this part would be the Arabs of Khuzestan and Ahwaz would be discriminated against based on this racial thing, and as well as the Turks in Iran, Azeri Turks. But the two other major pillars of the Iranian nationalism or Persian nationalism are Shiism and Persianism. One is linguistic and the other one is religious. And actually, it might surprise people to hear that these two elements have been fused and intersected since 1920s with the let's say 1920s would be a good date, yes, with the publication of the journal Iran Shahr, which was pretty much under the Nazi under the influence of the Nazi ideology, which not only propagated Aryanism, and at the same time it was talking about this distinct Iranian Islam, which represented by Shiism. So along with that, you have this Persianism, and with the creation of the Farhangistan or the Iranian Academy, which was the try to, just like Turkey, to illegalize in some ways all other languages, and then to convert every group to Persianism, linguistically, culturally, and at the same time, if you look the Iranian historiography, the one, especially the textbooks, or even that's produced in the West, mostly is a Persian-centered historiography. So these are the pillars of Persian nationalism. And Kurdish nationalism existed even before 1920s. I have written extensively about Sheikh Ubaidullah, who came to the political scene, especially in 1880s. He tried to create an independent Kurdistan. And so since then, mostly the Sunni Kurdish regions in Iran have been, so it has been the hotbed of Kurdish nationalism, which it has also been seen as a security threat from the state perspective. So the state has since 1920s advocating one nation, one language, and one country. And many of the components of Iranian policy did not fit into this picture, among especially the Kurds who were politically active, and Kurds and others. Whenever the state has been weak, when the center has not been able to exert its influence on the other region, we see these identitarian, anti-central movements that crop up, and they would demand, at least they have demanded certain political, cultural rights historically. This happened during 1940s, which created the Kurdistan Republic, or led to the creation of Kurdistan Republic, or sometimes called Mahabad Republic because the center was Mahabad. In Tabriz, there was this Azerbaijan Republic, and in Khuzestan, there was also these demands for greater Arab recognition of greater Arab and Arab culture and language. And in 1979, we have the same situation. And so Kurdistan has been politically more active probably than the rest of the region. And since 1920s, the state has been trying to deal with Kurdistan. And actually, there is a letter that was written in 1927 by the famous Iranian Prime Minister Muhammad Ali Foroughi, when tells Reza Shah, we cannot kill all the Kurds. Therefore, we have to find a better way to deal with them, because it talks about it's not feasible to completely wipe out the Kurds. But so this is has been the policy of the state, that try to fit everyone, or put everyone, or convert everyone to Persianism or some form of Persianism, but it hasn't worked. And so still, and the Islamic Republic has inherited the same thing. It's reflected in its constitution. And then the Islamic Republic has created two types of citizen. One, Persians, actively and actually Persians, and then those who are potentially can be Persian. So they are in this process of becoming Persians. So the Persian, the ones who are not actually Persians, they have to be turned into Persian. And if there is resistance, it had to be destroyed. And so you have to add Shiism to that, which has been one of the strongest elements in the new constitution, and try to, at the same time, if you are non-Shii, so you are doubly a threat to the state and its identity.
Thank you, Kemal. And I will say we are around like 40 minutes. So for the sake of the time, I will try to combine several questions together. I think one question, which is both asked by Shesan and Rezan, consider any prospect for improvement in the near future. Like, obviously the question becomes, as long as Islamic regime stays in power, could we imagine a future where you are not going to talk about the execution of Kolbers on a regular basis? And then related to that, I think that is interesting question as people who are studying the Kurdish issue, and this is coming from Ekrem Karakoç. I mean, I think many people are very familiar with the Anfal genocide and then all the repressive policies done by Turkey regarding the Kurdish people. But then, yeah, in a sense, you don't hear much about the Kurdish question in Iran in many ways. And I can even say that as somebody who is studying American politics, I mean, it is not even central to American foreign policy when it comes to Iran, despite the fact that America has its own reasons to basically really put lots of pressure on Iran. I mean, so then the question becomes, well, then how can you explain that? I mean, is it because of like the maybe relative obscurity of the Kurds in Iran, or basically the very repressive nature of the regime, so it's just almost impossible to kind of collect field research? So there's only two different questions, but maybe you want to start from the first one about like any improvements or change in the future.
I don't think there is a possibility to talk about to answer to the first question. There is no possibility of that. Actually, people who study Iran, they know since COVID-19 started, the executions have increased, especially in Kurdistan. And we constantly hear about executions, but the ones you constantly, people in general hear are if someone in the center or central cities is killed. But in Kurdistan, you have people executed in greater number, but there is not much talk about it. So because Kurds don't have the means to talk about it, and then as I said, people in the center, especially Persians, are not willing to talk about it. And there was a case in 2009 when a famous Kurdish teacher, Farzadeh Kamangar, was executed. Surya Fallah, who is a human rights activist in California, sent a letter to Shirin Ebadi and saying how she was disappointed when she was talking to the Persian human rights colleague that to talk and to voice the situation to talk about the situation of Farzad Kamangar. And they said, isn't he a terrorist? Because the state has declared him as a terrorist. So the state becomes the measure or the source of value when it comes to the Kurds. And so there is, the reality is the ruling ethnic nation is united about this situation. So, and if you look at the last 2 years reports by the United Nations Special Envoy, almost half of the political prisoners are Kurds, and almost half of the people who are executed are ethnically Kurds. And it's been since Rouhani has come to power, and the situation has been actually worse. So it's worsened, and it's much worse than, for example, a person like Ahmadinejad, who everyone saw him as a demon. And this person, Rouhani, was supposed to be leaning to some type of reformism. So I don't see there is any possibility. And as I mentioned, that now the state is trying, the Islamic State is trying to even evacuate some of the people from the villages, the bordering villages. And I don't think it's a limited thing, a limited project. I think it's a start, and they are trying to, to find out, this is like, it works like a satellite or a experimental case. If this one becomes successful, I don't think it would stop, and it would follow the Scotland, the policy like Saddam Hussein and the rest. But to come back to the other issue, why the Kurdish situation in Iran is not heard much about it. It has to do with a number of factors. One, in Turkey, there has been an ethnic democracy in reality. So Turkey has never had a democracy, but Turks had some type of democracy for the Turks. So it's an ethnic democracy. This ethnic democracy has created a situation that the politicians, the statesman, and the state has to be pretentious, and sometimes even regard Kurds like citizens, and the Kurds are able to use Turkish ethnic democracy for their own platform and talk about their own situation, and they find ways to end up in the parliament, and their voices are heard or it used to be heard in EU and other places. And so you have this ethnic democracy, and at the same time has been flirting with Europe. And before Erdogan becoming a godlike president, they were constantly negotiating with the EU, and they were trying to be a member of EU, and EU had a number of So you all know about the Turkish situation. So there were different measures for the reform in Turkey, which gave a certain space in Turkey and the rise of HDP kind of semi-legitimized Kurdish politics for the first time in history of the Kurds, if you ignore the Iraqi side. So otherwise, in the entire history, Kurdish politics has been always treated as a legitimate bastard. It doesn't matter whether it's armed or it's civil, it doesn't matter. So the ethnic democracy, ethnic theocracy or ethnocracy in Turkey has been somewhat helpful to the Kurds. Okay. The second, and of course, the relation with Turkey. And the other thing has been the fact that Turkey has been a member of NATO, despite all the problems we might have with NATO and other things. It has been a problem, okay. It has created its own pressure. In some ways, the NATO members are supposed to be democratic, which even the pretense of democracy sometimes has helped, and it has created a relation with the outside world. And it also, there is also one more thing, that in the northern Kurdistan, we have a longer history of migration. Since the Kurds in northern Kurdistan are not the first generation of migrants, they have a better ability to communicate with the outside world and voice their grievances and the injustice that they are going through for being Kurds.
There are two questions in the chat which are actually kind of similar to each other. So the question is obviously, if the Kurds in Iran engage in this trade across the border, they interact with the Kurds on the Iraqi side. I suppose mostly in the maybe Süleymaniye, Havremin area, but maybe a little bit north. So the question becomes then, does this kind of really contribute to some kind of a cross-border ethnic solidarity? And can it be also maybe interpreted as more like act of resistance? So this is the first question. And then Metin's question is basically more about how your work, how your scholarship is with Ahmet Muhammedpur received by the broader Iranian studies. I mean, like what was the reaction of maybe some scholars of Iran basically towards your approach? So if you basically respond to this question, then we can actually end the event after your responses. So thanks.
First, I'm sorry for what happened to, I don't know what was wrong with my computer. I was trying to reach you back using my iPhone, but it didn't work anyways. Hopefully, so thankfully I'm back. Let's first with Mr. Yüksel's question. Honestly, except for a few friends and like people who publish this journal of Iranian Nashr Azadi and issue Iranian academia, which they have been very good actually in embracing the things we say or allowing us to, even they had 2 interviews with us, and 1 or 2 other friends, they have completely ignored whatever we say. And it's across the board. And so inside Iran, we have actually our scholarship has received a little bit better than outside. And it's not surprising because the Persian academia outside is mostly apologists for the Iranian regime. And it's not surprising that how unhappy they were when someone like Qasem Soleimani, who had been involved in killing probably hundreds of thousands of people directly or indirectly, how sad they were. And they are the same group that are defending Revolutionary Guards as a national army. So if you compare the Iranian racism with Turkish racism, you can say in Turkish academia, almost, I'm about to say something crazy, but no, it's not comparable. Let's put it this way. So this is the situation. And actually, if, for example, given a platform to someone like me or Dr. Mohammadpour to talk about the Kurds or anyone, they think you might declare an independent Kurdistan right there. So this is how reactionary and how intolerant Persian academia is. So, and Persian study as well. So, and they think people like us, people like me, as crazy ultra-nationalists. And so it doesn't matter how much, whether I talk about Kolbers or people who are executed in prisons, since I or Dr. Mohammadpour or any friend who think that their execution and the injustice that is going on in Kurdistan because of their people's identity, and we expose that for them, this is a nationalism. So, but to go back to the first question, there is no doubt that there is a great deal of solidarity between Kurds in the east and the rest of Kurdistan. When, despite the fact that majority of the Kurds who are politically active might be sympathizer to the Kurdistan Democratic Party and Komala and some other groups, when Öcalan was extradited by the American and Israelis to Turkey, almost everyone came to the streets and they said, we are all Öcalan. They, despite the fact they might not like his politics and so forth. And when Jalal Talabani became a president of Iraq, people were dancing on the streets. And when, so anything, when the referendum held in Kurdistan, and there were talks about the referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, people were coming out to the streets and so holding Kurdish flags, and so probably hundreds of people were arrested for that. And when Kirkuk was occupied and all the atrocious things that happened there, if the people of PUK had not given these cities to the Hashd al-Shabi, thousands of Kurds were willing to go there and defend Kirkuk. When this happened to Afrin and Grespi and other areas of Rojava, again, you see the same thing. So there is certainly a great solidarity with the Kurds. And at the same time, Kurdish resistance in the East, in many ways, independent even from their own political parties. So they are really aware of many of the fundamental shortcomings of what's going on in the South. They are very unhappy with this discourse of Turkiye Lashma and Turkiyification, because many don't see any future for that, but they are still in solidarity with the Kurdishness aspect, and they feel that being a Kurd in the Middle East is a pride in itself. So whether you identify yourself as a Kurd, whether you emphasize your identity or not, you are collectively part of you are part of a collection, a people that you are considered as a security risk. In Syria, it's like this. In Turkey, it is the case. So it is in Iran. And now in Eastern Kurdistan, you have a lot of activities in the environmental fields, in writing novels, in even bringing libraries to the villages, in teaching Kurdish language, despite the fact people know Kurdish, but in terms of just reading and writing. The case of Zara Mohammadi, who had been sentenced for 10 years of imprisonment for teaching 10 years of Kurdish language under the government of God and Islamic Republic. So this is just one case that people in the East are very much conscious of their own situation, of their identity, and how their identity could pose a threat. And regardless whether you care about your Kurdishness or not, people who try to turn you into a Persian or Turks, they consider you a Kurd, and your identity is dangerous. Your identity is a security subject and matter, and this is how they see it, and that's why they are in great solidarity with all the Kurds in the region, but they are certainly, especially the intellectual or the more younger, vibrant intellectual segments of Kurdish population in the East, are very much aware of the shortcomings of the Kurdish politics in general.
So, Kemal, thank you very much. I think it was a very engaging and very informative event. So, I will basically want to close our event formally, and hopefully I will see some of you next time in November when we have the next event. So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for organizing. Thanks to everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you.
Dost pas.